Well, we're excited today to be here with Tanya Riches, who has a unique perspective on Hillsong Church just because she grew up there and was involved in the music ministry for many years there. And we're just excited to speak with her today, to interview her, and to get an inside scoop into what the Lord has really done at this incredible church over the last 25 years. So welcome, Tanya. Thank you for being willing to be interviewed today.
No worries. Great to be.
Good stuff. Well, why don't we jump right in? First question, tell us a little bit about how Hillsong Church was formed and how you and your family ended up going there and getting involved in the worship ministry.
Sure. So I was quite young when I went to Hillsong Church. I was probably about 7, and it was in the 80s. So it's a long time ago. So I think, some of my memories have been reconstructed through the process of doing my master's thesis, in which I investigated 10 years of Hillsong music. And then some are memories that, I have from being a little child. So, and stories that my parents have told me. So, for our family, my parents became born again in the Anglican Church in Australia. And the Anglican Church was very cessationist, so didn't believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit moving within and operative within the body of Christ today. They believed that it was within the biblical text only. And so my parents had this charismatic experience that was influenced from, I guess, America and from the amazing moves of God that were happening there. And they really felt like they wanted freedom in worship. And they heard of this Hillsong Church that was writing songs about the Spirit and was really had a freedom in worship. And so they turned up one Sunday when I was 7, and I think my dad just said that there were so many young people, and that was just overwhelming. And so for him, he really felt like going to Hillsong Church was really securing our future as Christians, and just he really made it was very clear in his head that he wanted to be a part of something that reached the next generation. So I think that's why we ended up there. And of course, Bobby and Brian had senior pastors, and they had come over from New Zealand to Australia and had planted a church in the Hills District area. And that's I guess my story within the whole.
Very cool. Now, in terms of Hillsong's philosophy of music and worship, what types of things did it value, and what really set it apart from what God was doing elsewhere in Australia and the world?
Sure. So I think one of the things that really comes through, and that I kind of touched on before, was that the Spirit was really a focus of the music and was very much a part of the experience of worship. And so it was a sense of, we come to worship to engage the Spirit and for the Spirit to be present in our midst. And it was a different philosophy, I think, than maybe more liturgical traditions, which can often be focused on teaching the Scripture through music, or can be, in terms of ritual, can be engaging the music of the church traditions. Instead of that, Hillsong really chose to formulate something that was allowed, I guess, God to be very present in the midst of the experience. And so it's called our experiential worship, and I think they've been really influential in helping to create something that is a new way, I guess, of engaging worship and music in church.
Now, we had talked before about just really how everything comes down from leadership and the value that Brian and Bobby, even from the get-go at its formation in the early 80s, that they put on worship. And I remember you even mentioning that Brian actually wrote some of the earliest songs that were being sung in the church. Can you speak to that?
So I think he sometimes says that he gets royalty checks still, and they're like $2 or something, really like 89 cents or something. But in the early days, he was very deliberate about putting the theology of the church into song. And so there's one song that I remember singing in church, which is called Heaven Suffers Violence and the Violent Take It by Force, which is not a scripture that normally is used in worship music. But it was a really fun song, and everyone danced to it, and Brian, I think, was the main writer on that song. So, and yeah, there's other songs, like if you go back to the early records, he participated in the songwriting process. And I think as well, a lot of the songs of Hillsong were inspired by sermons that were spoken by the pastors, by Brian, Bobby, various pastors. And yeah, it's a dialogue between the preaching and the worship, and I really like to think about it like that, in that I can see that both has influenced each other. So the song For This Cause was really inside a book that Brian wrote later, so I can see that it goes both ways. So the music inspires the sermons inspire the music, and I think that helps create a really unified kind of approach to Christian living that is really something that they've modelled. That great relationship between a worship pastor and a senior pastor it's exemplary at Hillsong.
Well, even as you mention it, I get thoughts about John and Charles Wesley, and just seeing the partnership between the music minister and the sermon writer, and just even going back to the 1800s, it was much more prominent that pastors and teaching pastors were writing lyric. So it makes sense that even in those early days that he had a role in that. You mentioned a couple of those early songs. From what I understand, "The Power of Your Love" was probably the first live album, if I remember correctly. But weren't there a couple of independent albums, studio albums that were recorded before then?
Yes, Spirit and Truth, I think, was the first album, and then "The Power of Your Love," was a larger project, but the second release. So I think it was like they kind of did the first album, and the songs were just going nuts. Like, they were just being sung by churches all over Australia, Catholic churches, Anglican churches, just places that you wouldn't have expected. And I think it really allowed those churches to engage the Spirit in the midst of their worship and to be exposed to some of the charismatic movement in a very uniquely Australian way. And I think that's really a lot of the power that, Hillsong's music has had, is the way that it travels, and it helps churches to really engage God in a different way.
Now, even in those early days, what do you think the appeal was to, an Anglican church or a Catholic church, to the music that was being written out of this charismatic movement? Because mostly when we consider other denominations, they're usually, especially charismatic, sometimes they keep them at arm's length. But it seems like through the power of music, it transcended denominational differences. Was that the case in those early years, even with the music that you saw being released at Hillsong?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a couple of things that could be said about that. First one is just the way that songwriters approach the writing process in the two traditions. So, and I think Hillsong's been so influential, probably bled into the, some of the more modern hymn writers. But I think, I've talked to a number of songwriters within the Anglican or Church of England tradition in Australia, and a lot of them approached it from the perspective of writing new hymns. So, I think a lot of the forms, it's kind of a joke, but kind of reality. That they love, a first verse that looks at Adam, a second verse that looks at the fall, a third verse that looks at, Jesus, and then a fourth verse that looks at eschatology. Mm-hmm. And the ways that lyric is written in that tradition is crafted. It's very highly, you need to be kind of highly educated to really understand how it flows, and there's a lot that we can borrow from that tradition, and I think that's it's a part of Charles Wesley, and like Luther, there were some hymn writers, and I think those songs have great value. I think what Hillsong tried to do, and the difference that it brought in, was that it really tried to look at what was on the radio, and to look at the forms of music on the radio, and to try and use vernacular language, and to put those same biblical thoughts, and theologize in a vernacular way. And I think that does speak, and in reflection now, I think it speaks to people who are not educated, people who are immigrants, people who are maybe lower socioeconomic stratas of society, and because it's immediately accessible, it's in their language and they can understand it. So I don't think it has to be an either or. I think the beauty for Anglican churches is that they get to draw from both. So they have a beautiful liturgy, that has a great depth and meaning, but they also get to take the Hillsong CDs and maybe select 2 or 3 songs and put them in when it's thematically appropriate. And they have something that's very contemporary in the midst of their worship. So I think there's a great appeal for the mainline denominations to use Hillsong's music, and I think there's great appeal, you know, for sharing of cultures so that we can really learn from each other. And I know that, you know, some of the Hillsong writers have been, you know, have done a lot of conversation with Anglican theologians and have tried to expose themselves to other liturgy, to the liturgical forms, in order to try and put that in contemporary language that makes sense within their context. So I think it's really about the body of Christ and just really being full and really taking things that are traditional and maybe putting them in vernacular language and in ways that are accessible to, you know, just the ordinary people.
It's interesting to use that, to hear you use that language to put the words and their music into the vernacular, because it very much is reminiscent of really what Martin Luther championed in the Reformation. And when we look at what Hillsong has done to the worship landscape in the 25 years, it would be appropriate to say that they really did reform the way the contemporary church sings. So it comes by no surprise that you would use such language. I think that's very appropriate for that, and really does speak to the legacy that they've left, really, and how the Lord's used them. Now, tell me, Tanya, what are some of your earliest memories being involved in the worship ministry, and who were some of the key people involved in leading and forming Hillsong's music ministry from the get-go?
Sure. I think one of my earliest memories, and which was like I kind of had to split Hillsong's music over the 10 years that I was kind of involved into phases, because I think the one thing that really comes through from when you're a part of the church, and I think I really want to emphasize that Hillsong is a church. It's a church that makes music. It's not a music publisher that has a church. And so, you know, I was a part of the church. And I think, like, change is something that really just is something that was really a part of my experience. The amazing change. The change from when I turned up in a warehouse that as a 7-year-old and it was, you know, under 1,000 people, through to now as 25,000 people gathering in Sydney in 60-something services across the weekend. The change is really amazing. But there's definitely a core and a commitment to core values that I've seen consistent throughout that time. So the first phase, you know, and some of my earliest memories are really about, we used to have these amazing rock musicals. So, like they would, there was Rebel Love, and then there was Rebel Love 2, and it would always have a motorbike somewhere in it, and people in leather jackets singing these awesome rock anthems. And so one of my earliest memories is being involved in a musical with Salty, and I never forget this because it's so funny now, because Rebecca St. James, who's quite famous, was a part of this musical, and her and I did a duet. And I always laugh because, you know, she's like this amazing, you know, worship leader, and I kind of just find myself in the jungles of Papua New Guinea and doing, like, you know, these. I just think I could have had that live, but it's quite funny, like, how important those events were to the community, and just really putting music into rock, you know, style, and exploring maybe stuff and genres that wasn't maybe allowed in church before. That was something they were really experimental with in that phase, and so that's definitely a memory. And then I think, you know, another really important memory is really the beginning of what became the United Band, which was really an experience that came out of the summer camps that we had every year. And we would kind of go, it would be a week in the middle of the searing hot January holidays, and we would turn up at a beach and just really spend like hours in prayer, hours in worship, hours, you know, in the Word. And I just remember this one year where we brought along 4 delirious songs, and so our church was singing really gospel-inspired, you know, songs at the time, and like some of Russell Fragar's amazing songs, you know, really high energy rock, gospel stuff, and the youth started singing these delirious songs, and it was just so different, and it, like, literally, they were beautiful worship songs, and there was something just on them, like, that the song, it's open up the doors and let the people sing.
Yeah, did you feel the mountains tremble?
Yeah, did you feel them? Exactly. And the youth just started dancing. It was just like the Spirit of God was so present in the room and in their worship, and they just would not stop dancing. So, basically, I just remember us getting to the third or fourth day, and we'd sung these 4 songs to death. And Ruben Morgan just was like, we had this emergency meeting, and he was like, we need new songs. This is killing me. We've done 2 weeks, and this, because we had the wildlife younger age youth group first, and then, the powerhouse one. And so he went into his room and he wrote My Redeemer Lives. And he wrote it by jumping up and down and working out the right tempo that the youth could dance at. And he just wrote a song around this so that the dancing could continue, that this amazing move of God could continue. We didn't want to wreck it, So, I remember, that song being introduced, and I just remember how that really transformed our church. And, so there, I guess, some of my memories. Might have 20, lots of years of them. But I think, Ruben Morgan was one of the people who he was just really instrumental in that move of God. And then, of course, the younger musicians who are now really a part of who we handed United over to. So Joel Houston, Marty Sampson was a worship leader and writer who's just completely after God's own heart. So I think, he's not necessarily as prominent on the albums anymore, but, and they're really, and people like Matty Crocker were taught by him and by some of the leaders. I think it's very much a tradition where you pass on your knowledge to the next, the person who'll take over you. So, and Darlene obviously was really instrumental in that and taught us how to do that. So I think, those are some of the people. Also, David Moyes was a music director who was absolutely and utterly just so important in changing Hillsong's music. Russell Frager, Brendan Badham, Steve McPherson put a lot of the industrial mechanisms underneath it. The list could go on forever. There's 800 members, and every single one of them plays a part. So I think,
Very good. Now, many people, remember even before Darlene, Jeff Bullock really being your guys' first music pastor and really kind of championing the vision for Hillsong music and helping lay the foundation. What are your memories of Jeff and his leadership and his music and his role in leading those early days? And what are some of the early Hillsongs that he wrote that gained traction in Australia and that were being used by churches there and really helped get the ball rolling?
The best it is a long time ago, so I don't want to romanticize it or demonize the memories, but I think one of the things that Jeff was entirely gracious, entirely aware of humanity and his humanity. He also had experience of being in a mainline denomination and really brought that to the worship experience and really was writing songs that genuinely had a call for Australia. And I think, there's something really beautiful about it. I think it's really easy as writers to write for a global audience, but I've really been challenged to write for a particular people, not just for the global world. I think there's something really important about writing for people. And I think he really helped us to work out how to write for our congregation, for our people, to localize worship. And that was just phenomenal, life-changing, His thoughts on the scripture were just, he would stand up, read a scripture, and then he would just have these amazing creative thoughts. We used to joke it was eternally creative, so it came with highs and lows, and he was all of those things. And I think he had such high expectations of what he could deliver, and was amazingly creative. Would sit down and write a musical, in one go. We would just write songs. They would just kind of just come out, and you'd sing them in the congregation, and they just would hang in the air. There was something really incredibly anointed about what he did. So But also he was just a really pastoral person. You know, I remember this one meeting where he just said, you know, here are some people who are going through like some hard stuff. Could you just bombard them with love? Could you just write them letters? Could you just, you know, and he was always on the lookout for those people in the community who, were maybe on the edges or who were struggling. He was eternally kind to me. So, you know, I have only good memories, and, you know, it was really beautiful to meet up with him again and to interview him through my master's project, and just to be able to say thank you, to say, you know, thank you so much for all of this, you know, all of the biblical and, you know, passion for Jesus that you really helped ignite in me. And so I think, you know, he does deserve honour, and in the sense that, you know, he really, really did do something very unique, and it's not to undervalue what Darl's, you know, and her amazing, stellar, I guess, vision. But yeah, definitely he is a very special person.
And I think a lot of people look to Hillsong music and, you know, for just because of the time that she was there, look to Darlene as kind of the figurehead. And sometimes we can forget the role that the Lord used Jeff in to really help set the foundation. And another question I wanted to ask is, probably in North America, the song that we're most familiar with of Jeff's is The Power of Your Love, which was the title of the first live album that you guys did. How would you characterize Jeff's music and Jeff's songs? What would you use to describe them, and what was unique about them?
I think that is really funny, and I think reflecting on what really great has gained traction in America and what was really instrumental in Australia is two different things. And I think that's the beauty about the CDs, is that, you know, there was 12 songs and you know, they spoke to different people in different ways. So for us, like, I would say the absolutely most influential song that Jeff Bullock wrote was The Great Southland of the Holy Spirit, which was really a national anthem that we integrated and that really enabled Australians to, we're a very secular society, but enabled us to really recapture this sense of why we were named Australia. You know, Terras Australis came from this sense of the land of the Holy Spirit, and that was the vision when, you know, De Quiria named Australia. So I think, you know, to return to that and to say, you know, maybe something great could even come out of Australia was something that really just captured the imagination of Australians. I think The Power of Your Love was like this amazingly strong ballad, and I think that's maybe why, you know, Americans were really taken by it. It was this sense of, like, it was irrepressible. The song is just like this, when you lead it as a worship leader, it's like it just is this such a powerful anthem that really is sung in the power of the Spirit. So yeah, I think it is really interesting reflecting on the songs that, you know, have been taken by the American audiences and they're used by the American audiences, and the differences between so I think, you know, one of the songs that really just spoke to me and that I love and that I still sing around the house when I'm worshiping is I Will Never Be the Same Again. Yeah. And that song is, oh my goodness, it's just beautiful. And it really encapsulated for me what I really felt that worship was. It was a sense of walking into a liminal space, you know, which we talk about in ritual studies, but where it's like the rest of the world you almost put pause on. So, you know, you walk into the worship space and it's like this entirely new world where you can engage God and where God can change you. But when you walk out, that you're entirely different. And that something really has to change about us. Something really, our very selves and physiology changes because we engage God in this moment. And I think that is true, you know. There was very much a sense that we create the boundaries around this space, and protecting that experience is really important. So, yeah, I think, you know, we saw amazing healings. We saw transformations of people who were emotionally transformed in God. And those songs really created that space and the expectation that this could happen in worship.
The one thing that I notice about some of those early Jeff Bullock songs, you know, even the lyric of Power of Your Love, Lord, I come to you, let my heart be changed and renewed, they seemed like simple prayers. Another song, I'm pretty sure Jeff wrote it, and you might be able to tell me for sure, but that I find myself singing around the house, from Stones Been Rolled Away, Let Your Presence Fall. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
So, you know, and these songs were, you know, Let Your Presence Fall, the lyric is, Lord, come upon us now with your healing power and let your presence fall. You know, just very, very simple prayer-like songs. And I think part of the appeal to the broader, you know, North American culture is these were just simple prayers, simple cries to God, that their palatability was based in the humanity that we all have in needing a Savior and wanting a language to respond to Him. You know, I even think of Darlene's song, Let the Peace of God Reign, and just, you know, the power of that prayer, and being able to sing that back to the Lord as a language of worship. One of the things that we talked about not too long ago was you were describing these early songs as being kind of gospel-driven. And when I think of the early Hillsongs, I think piano-driven white gospel. Would that be a correct assumption? And who would have contributed to that? Would that have been both Jeff and Russell?
Well, I think it was really about what was coming into Australia at that point. You know, so I think, and you know, maybe it's just because we get stuff late, you know. But I think, you know, some of the things that were really happening and the moves of God that were really happening were being in America were also happening in the sounds of white gospel, and, you know, and some beautiful black gospel as well, that, you know, artists that collaborated with Hillsong and that Hillsong really connected with. And I think, you know, back to the CDs that were really influential, like I can't really speak before, I don't remember really very much before 1996 in terms of that, but I do know, like, Mariah Carey's Christmas album was huge in Australia, and that had an influence because it crossed this divide where you could sing Christian songs, but they were also on the radio. And gospel had this power, you know, to transcend through those secular sacred spaces and to be both. And I think also of the, you know, in terms of the influence later, the Brownsville Revival CDs were hugely influential. And I remember, you know, we've been playing those and loving them and just going, we could write like this. You know, we could use some of these styles and it would be entirely different and in the Australian context. And I think the transformation out of that was that, you know, we realised that Australians don't necessarily sing white gospel in the rest of their lives. It's not really a local sound. So I think, you know, some of the transformation into indie rock has really been trying to find that Australian sound and really relate to just the ordinary Aussie on the street. You know, he's walking past and, you know, I think indie rock has this really genuine and authentic kind of feeling about it. But it's still, you know, something that people recognise in London or in New York. And, I think that probably is why the sound has moved quite a bit. But gospel was entire. We were so funny. We're like this Australian church, you know, singing gospel songs. And I look back and I think it's so funny. We loved it.
Absolutely. I can remember watching a video of All Things Are Possible and just thinking, you know, this is white gospel. You know, brass section, and just the presentation, this is white gospel. Now, Tanya, tell me, what events and people and partnerships and songs contributed to Hillsong Church coming to national prominence? The partnership with Integrity Music was very strategic. Can you help explain how that all came about? I remember we had talked earlier about just the intentionality with some of the businessmen and Russell Fragar's visits to North America. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in my research, I really found that Russell Fragar had been an incredible just help to setting up Hillsong Publishing. He has this mind that it's like a dual processes. He can do the mechanical and the industrial and business, you know, kind of thinking. Also, is this entirely creative person. So he was really influential. He and a guy called Mike Murphy were part of back in the day, and they realised that Hillsong songs had started to gain traction, and Jeff had, you know, they were like, Jeff, you just need to write songs, because it really, I mean, you know, it was like that was the best use of his time. And then publishers were coming to them and asking, you know, how we get these songs out. Churches were just bombarding them with questions. So the two of them got onto a plane and travelled to America, and Russell called it the Laugh Along Tour, which I thought was really just, they just do two Aussies, you know, having like just the time of their lives, and they went to a whole heap of American publishers and had discussions on how to set up a publishing company. You know, they wanted to start with the end in mind, and which is just, it's absolutely incredible that they did this, you know, like this little church in Australia gets on a plane and decides, you know, what would it look like if we had this multinational, you know, amazing publishing company. So the thing that they really reflected upon was that when a songwriter really becomes great, so when they were thinking of Jeff, you know, and his songs at this point, oftentimes American publisher will remove them from the context and put them on the road. And so the song that is really, and the songs that are formed from this engagement between songwriter and congregation kind of get, it gets hijacked because the songwriter is now on the road and they see a new group of people time and time after again. So this process of music being written with the people, it gets really it gets stifled, and they felt like that was really crucial to what the song had become so important. So they felt like it was really important to see the church as the art. So they were really instrumental in creating this completely new paradigm where it wasn't Jeff Bullock that was the artist, but the church was, and that the church created these songs and this unique contribution that they brought. So the mechanics of the way that Hillsong does all of its contracts and, you know, the way that it does all its legalities is the church is the artist, and Hillsong Church writes the songs. And the artists are members of Hillsong Church, all of them. And Hillsong Church, they do all of the, you know, volunteering, whatever is necessary to be considered a member and to be a part of the church body. And then I think, you know, they really, Russell really just created something very fresh and new. And I think now we're seeing that with, you know, churches like Jesus Culture, and there's a number of churches that are the artists now. And I think Hillsong, you know, it was really important to them. And I think one of the benefits that we see is that Hillsong really has longevity. And so different artists move through Hillsong Church, like Jeff, like Darlene, like Russell, but yet it still continues. And I think that's something that, you know, for me, you know, over here studying at Fuller, is actually something really amazing that I love, is that I did a little part of this, you know, but it's a lot larger than me. And that is really motivating as an artist to be a part of, you know, and to think that's amazing, you know, that it continues way beyond what I will ever be able to do with my lifetime.
Yeah, I think the evidence of God's hand on Hillsong Church is exactly like you said. It has sustained its influence despite the coming and goings of really key people who for a season played a role in it. But you're right, it never was really, as much as we may make it that way in America, it's never really been attached to a person. The Lord's anointing has been on the church as a whole. Now today, even when Hillsong travels, do they travel as a core group out of the church?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think that's one thing that Brian and Bobby, it's very much, mission is done by the church. And mission might look like, you know, going to Rwanda and doing a mission there, or it might look like a music tour. And I think that's something that is like the church prays for it. You know, we, like recently, you know, the United team were on tour to America, and I was in like the hills, like the initial kind of congregation, and they did a little Skype. You know, they're like, "Hey, we're in Miami. Like, please pray for us." And I know that there are so many older couples in the church that really take it upon themselves to pray for the musicians as a part of Hillsong. It's us. It's not you know, JD and Jad and all of the guys doing a tour and separate. They really own it, and I think that's the power of it, is that, you know, it's a church mission. And I think it looks different from maybe how mission has looked in the past, but it's very much, you know, that's how they see it, and that's how the church prays and believes for it.
That's incredible. Now, going back to the whole foundation of the publishing company and whatnot, Russell comes over to North America. Obviously, there was some interest from Integrity Music. Can you tell us what you know a little bit about that and how that partnership? I wasn't sure if Don Moen was involved in that or how that all kind of came about, but tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually don't know who people who were involved in it were, but I do know, I really know. And I think this is the thing, they're so great at just getting on with the business of doing church that a lot of times history isn't written down. And so I know that they negotiated out this particular contract. They were really deliberate about what they were doing. And I know that Shout to the Lord was their first album that was supposed to be a collaboration recording. And it was during that process that Jeff really felt like he couldn't continue. And so basically Russell, they did all the rehearsals without Jeff, and Jeff really, he had tried to, he says that he had tried to earlier on, kind of slide out, but he was way too popular and way too loved really to ever do that. And I think that's sort of the tension for the celebritization, of the people who are involved is that, their lives get really taken by this process. And so basically Darlene rehearsed with the band, and a couple of days before, maybe like 3 days before the album, Jeff rang and said, "I'm not going to turn up." And the team were just devastated to lose their leader, but also devastated that, he wasn't going to go into the next phase with them. And so basically, that guys were all Australia. And, I think it was, Darlene was the first woman worship leader that they ever recorded, and it was simply a mistake from their perspective. And Russell said, they weren't at all, excited about the possibility of, having a woman lead the worship. And I think it's really now, it just goes down in history as being something, of course Darlene would lead worship. But it was a really tumultuous time for the team. And I think, for Brian personally, he really questioned without Jeff, whether Hillsong could continue to write songs. And then, of course, you look at the popularity of Shout to the Lord, and you kind of think, and some of the songs that have been, Mighty to Save is a recent example of that. I think there's definitely a calling upon Hillsong to write music, but all of that was very much in question. And so, during the recording, and I think Darlene shared this with you as well, that they just were really devastated. Donna Crouch had taken over the team. She was a pastor, not necessarily, she led worship, but she was a pastor, not so much a musician. And and I think they cried their way through that recording, but of course Darlene turned out to be probably one of the best worship leaders of our era. So,
it's really amazing when you look back on it, and I can see Integrity's perspective at the time, because up until this point, like you mentioned, there hadn't been ever a female worship leader that they had recorded. I remember you telling me earlier that they when they found out that Jeff was backing out, they very reluctantly agreed that they would still go through with the recording. And, I even wonder in the back of my mind, they're thinking, okay, we'll record this, but maybe releasing it's a whole other question,
Right.
But, when I look at that recording, and, I have a copy of it on my computer, the songs that were off that one recording, you've mentioned some of them already, The Power of Your Love, which I think the recording at the time ended up being really a compilation of what the Lord had done in recent years, and was the American introduction. But This Kingdom, and The Power of Your Love, and Let the Peace of God Reign, and People Just Like Us, and then of course Shout to the Lord. And I've always thought that specific recording, I've heard the one on the People Just Like Us album, but in my opinion, there's just something very anointed about that recording, and that even though I know it was recorded on an early album for you as an Australian, in terms of North America's exposure, that is the definitive recording, and still is the recording that is most associated with Darlene and what is played on radio stations. And maybe you can talk a little bit to that. Shout to the Lord for. I can remember being a young guy and learning to play the piano. I think the song was published in '93, and I probably was learning it around '95, '96. My exposure came to it through the Toronto Blessing, which I was a part of in Toronto, and we had learned the song through that. And I remember sitting, looking at the sheet music, and thinking to myself, perhaps even arrogantly, oh, who's this Darlene how do you pronounce her? This sounds like a one-hit wonder. And boy, oh boy, was that a wrong assessment of her, because she went on to write so many great songs that we'd sing in the church. But such a monumental song. And when we look at music publishing, especially in America, we often say, we have a saying that says it only really takes one song to get an artist, a church, a worship leader kind of on the map. Would you agree that Shout to the Lord was the song that brought national prominence to
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, because as a songwriter, I feel these tensions between what is, the musical mechanisms that we use to get these songs out, and then also the process when we write them. Shout to the Lord, Darlene has spoken about her experience. I think she has a book, on Shout to the Lord. It was written from a really deep place of struggle. It was written from a place where, she wasn't, none of this could be seen at all. And I think inside her, she knew that there was this thing that needed to be birthed. And she's always been like that, she sees well beyond the future, well beyond the present. But she was, and like I stayed over at, the house where she wrote the song. It's this tiny little house that they'd bought, they'd finally got the Australian dream of buying their own home, tiny little home, and they had 2 little babies, and, she was at the piano, and I think it was just in an absolute silence, of knowing that she had a call to do something, but, knowing that she was geographically in Australia, nowhere, and that there was, really, there was nothing to think that it would become a song that, so many people sing, but it was a song of faith and a song of triumph in that season. And I think so often we can get drawn to the mechanical mechanisms, but I love the song's perspective in that, all of the great big song, all of that stuff is really irrelevant for the writer. The writer sits down and writes from a place of engaging God, and that, a place of crying out. And that crying out is something that gets God's attention, and that I think His Spirit is just so drawn to. It's that, Darlene talks about the irresistible, cry of humanity to God. He's just got this, and likewise, God's love is just irresistible, and she wrote a whole song on that, irresistible love. And I think, there's that sense of, for her and for all the writers who truly have, been a part of Hillsong, it's been purely about putting songs that are cries of humanity's hearts and, returning to the scripture and having that amazing experience of really meeting God, and then putting that in song in the way that the congregation can. So really, I think Darlene, she's so down to earth. She never talks about the big mechanisms or like the publishers, or, you never hear us talk about that or the marketing or anything like that. I think, she's just really trying to pursue God's Spirit. And that for me, is a really great model to follow as a songwriter. I think, publishing, I'm so grateful for publishing dudes and for all the people who make all of that stuff happen, But I also, that great song is never birthed out of a place of wanting fame. It's birthed out of a place of wanting God. And I think, for me, that's something, a takeaway for me from the whole Shout to the Lord experience, and just keeping pure, keeping the heart of a songwriter set on the right thing, which is Jesus,
Well, that's good. Building on that, 1996 brings this partnership with Integrity. Massively popular song, Shout to the Lord, happens. After all this happened, did anything practically have to change in your music department to respond to the increasing appeal of Hillsong music? We talked before that there was this sense that the eyes of the world were kind of watching Hillsong Church now, and certainly, like you said, you're trying to protect yourself from all the bad stuff and the fame that went with that. But just on a practical basis, this monster song, like that, this little song born in this church in Australia is now being sung. Well, I've heard it said that it's the most recorded modern worship song of all time. what had to change practically? Did anything really change in your music department, or was there a sense of, oh my goodness, what's God doing now?
Yeah, I think there's two answers. Like, the first one is not really. You know, we still, you know, even now when I go back to Hillsong, really, it's really just about finding that place with God from which a song is born, and that it gets harder to carve out that time, and it gets harder to really carve out that place. But ultimately, that is still what they're all about. I think on the other side of that is that, yes, of course, things changed. And I remember one conference, you know, where we were standing on stage, and I think, you know, the United band was leading the worship, and it was Reuben Morgan and Mark Stevens who were kind of on either than me. So that's kind of who I remember. But it was a Hillsong conference, and for some, I guess the CD had just been released in America, and what I love about, you know, North America, and just is this sense of pursuing God wherever He is. You know, North Americans will turn up. So, and for some reason, you know, it just the way that this meeting worked, there were suddenly all these people who were very unfamiliar with Hillsong and what it stood for and the worship forms, who were suddenly there at this conference. And I remember we'd been moving towards the front of the stage, and suddenly there was this screaming, and all these hands were put towards him. And we looked at each other and we went, something's changed. Something has very, very, very different. And I think that is something that, you know, has been a real tension in that what is at the heart of Hillsong is a worship experience with God. And often what gets exported is that, I mean, in order to sell a CD or in order to, you know, market a CD, you have to kind of put the artists on there, you know. You can't kind of have a blank cover and no information in the CD booklet. But in some ways, that is kind of how Hillsong thinks about worship. It doesn't matter who's on stage or who's writing, and there are vehicles who are used of God, but it's not so much about the celebrity as it is about that moment and making sure that we're attentive as a community to God. I think it really, managing the global community is something that is hard, and I think, you know, things have actually really, it's gotten a lot bigger. I think, you know, in terms of like. And also just the necessity to keep people, to keep the external audience up to date on what's happening inside the organisation and why the songs are being written. You know, the questions about Hillsong have changed as it's gone on. So, you know, initially there were different questions, and now, you know, I think really there's a lot of questions about how the songwriting process happens, how the theology is put into song. People have different questions, and I think, you know, there's a genuine understanding that there's a responsibility that comes now with a global audience to walk people through those questions. And so, yeah, I think we have to, you know, the team have to be really cognizant of that and address that. And you know, I think as well, like when you go from having a choir of 30 to having a choir of hundreds, you know, logistically, there's probably other things that need to get done. And administration for the team is just, you know, a crazy, like rostering 1,000 people on to 65 services, you know, definitely things have changed in that regard, but the heart of it is still the same. So, you know.
That's wonderful. You know, you were talking a little bit about the marketing, and one of the things I've always appreciated about Hillsong is that there seems to always have been a good compromise between, you know, the inevitable needing to kind of market an artist, and a lot of that time that's been Darlene as the worship leader, but even in the album artwork over the years, there's a real sense that this is the church. You know, there aren't singular, you know, headshots separate from group shots or separate from, you know, pictures of the church. I'm even thinking of, you know, the back cover of By Your Side, or even the front of Blessed, or even the captions on the Hope album. You get this sense that this is about a church. This isn't just about one person. And I can't remember if you told me this through the years or if somebody else has told me, but just so impressed with even Marty Sampson's stance on this. And I know that in the past he's really shied away from having that kind of prominent out front role, just because he has not desired to be a personality, but really wants to leave room and make sure that Jesus Christ gets all the glory and that he's in the spotlight all the time instead of a person. And what a wonderful testimony to have as a worship leader.
Yeah, I think Joel Houston has been really instrumental in changing the marketing practice of Hillsong. Initially, and I think, you know, it's because by the time Hillsong entered the worship genre, it was already its genre. You know, Christian contemporary music in Australia is not a genre. You can't, like, for an artist to really make a living off their music, you know, they have to be doing secular music, or you have to be supporting yourself in another way. I think that's what's really unique about the American context. And there was already a language of marketing to that genre of the people who accepted that music. And so the early, like, 90s or the mid-90s album covers have got that. You know, we started off with just landscape photos, really, of Ken Duncan, who's a brilliant Australian photographer. But when we converged with the American audience, you know, that's when really the headshots started to come in. And so you have the iconic, you know, 3 heads and the congregation, because we were trying to mediate, you know, I think, you know, it was really trying to mediate that tension. And now, you know, Joel has really done a great job in pulling it away from those headshots and into, you know, more pictures of the church and things that represent Hillsong as a church. And I think, you know, the marketing team throughout that time have been so attentive to the Spirit and trying to work out how do we use marketing language, but also do it in a way that, you know, represents who we really are, which is we're not about the marketing. We're really about God and about having experience with God in worship and in a church community that is unique to any other part of life. So how do you put that into a product, you know? And I definitely, you know, George Agajanian has leads the more business arm of Hillsong Church, and he's one of the most Spirit-led people, you know, that I have observed growing up in the church. It's amazing the way he brings business practice and you know, that spirituality together. So I think it's been a journey, and I don't think that, like, Darlene in my thesis was incredibly explicit about the fact that she's never been involved in any marketing practice of the church, and she deliberately withdrew herself from those conversations. So I think Joel has come in and been a little bit more hands-on and said, you know, could we get rid of the 3 heads? Because really we're about the people, you know. So yeah, and I think, you know, I think they feel as well that they achieve their goals to different levels. Sometimes they're happy with the product. Sometimes, you know, they think, whatever. But I think, you know, they do an annual release every year. So there's always another opportunity to try again in that sense. You know?
Well, that's a great way of looking at it. Well, Tanya, we've talked a lot about the past. Let me shift into kind of current and the future now. But first, before we do, you worked under the leadership of Darlene Zschech. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to serve under her and what you think your greatest contribution to Hillsong music was?
Her greatest contribution. Amazing. I think she's an amazingly inspiring leader. She is absolutely uncompromising. Focus is one of her strengths. It's amazing. Just absolutely uncompromising to the biblical word, and really seeing that permeate through what she does. And also just simplicity. She's completely and utterly determined to live a very simple life. And I think that's why she did remove herself from all of the conversations about marketing. It's just complex. It's so complex. And I think, you know, that to me is a voice that is in my head constantly, you know, keep it simple, Tanya. Like, don't complex it up. Keep it really simple. It's not about anything else other than worshiping God and that relationship between humanity and God, and my relationship between God, between me and God. So that's a huge contribution. I think also, though, she had a real commitment, and this is another book that she's written, The Generational Transition, and she has an incredible commitment to the next generation. And that is something that I think really is really upon our generation to really also share that passion. Because, you know, when I think, I was 16 when my song was released, you know, when I think of a 16-year-old being released, you know, in a large church setting.
Yeah, let's actually jump in and stop there, because I don't think we've talked about that, and I think that's really fascinating. Jesus, What a Beautiful Name is the song that you're referring to. Give us a little story behind that, because that's a song that even today is sung, you know, by countless congregations. It's such a wide appeal, and I actually was logging on YouTube last night and was watching you lead your updated contemporary version that you wrote a chorus for. It's such a beautiful song that resonated with so many people. Bring us back to that time. Here you are, a 16-year-old young lady writing a song that would go. I remember singing it in our church growing up. That made its way to Canada. So tell us a little bit about the song, how it came about, and how you found your church singing it.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was at 16. I was just a high school student. I mean, yeah, I think that's. I don't know about American system, but in Australia, I was a high school student, and yeah, just really passionate about worship. Had been a part of choirs in the past, but when I got involved in Hillsong's worship, I really just felt like it was this release. It was this amazing way of talking to God, like you said, a prayer, sung prayers, and I think that was really just releasing and really allowed me to really be able to express my sexuality in a way that I hadn't been able to found before. So I was just part of the choir, and one summer camp wrote a song, and it's funny because I think, for me, my family was really in a tumultuous situation. I love my family so much, I think, my dad was really struggling with alcohol and it was a really difficult place to be in, and I found that worship was a release and was a way to really be able to find freedom and to sing towards the future of the reality of the family that I have now, and I think, Jesus, What a Beautiful Name was really just sung thank you. It was really just an adoration song. This is all the things that you are to me, Jesus, and written in rhyme, so I think it was really very simple and but what I think is really incredible is just the way that, that very simple prayer had resonance with other people in the congregation, that they also felt like they wanted to sing about Jesus and to just adore Jesus for no other reason than just for the fact that he is worthy. And so I think, when we introduced that song, and there was lots of, questions. Is it right to publish a 16-year-old? Is it right to put a girl, who's in school in front of a congregation? And I think Jeff really, he really questioned that, and it was when it was, after he left, really it was like, well, you know what, like, maybe it is right. Maybe this is, the new generation, and maybe that is a song that can be sung. And I think we had never thought that anyone from my generation would write songs. Jeff was an amazing talent, and it would be audacious to have stood up and said, I'd like to be a songwriter, but I think it is a gift and a calling on the church. And so, if a little 16-year-old can write a song that goes around the world, then, it really shows that there's something about the worship of that church and the way that it, speaks to the world. So, I mean, I look back and I think it's not particularly, it's maybe not the most theological of songs, it doesn't have propositions on Christology, but it is a theologizing on Christology. It's thinking about what Jesus did, an adoration that I think we need.
Absolutely. And you know what, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I even think of that album, God Is in the House, and your song's on there, and I think Lord, I Give You My Heart was on there as well by Reuben Morgan. So here, like, I look back and I look on history, and could it be that we were seeing just the beginnings of what would, what the Lord was beginning to do, even in the youth ministry, and the seeds that were being planted by the next generation that was coming up through Hillsong. I know you're gonna hate me for doing this, but I actually have a clip of it here from God Is in the House. Let me just play it, because I think some of the people watching would be interested and might even recognize this. But let me just play the first verse. This is Jesus, What a Beautiful Name. It's a gorgeous song, and I think, man, I wish I was writing like that at 16. Who's singing that on the God Is in the House album?
Yeah, so that's my friend Lisa. She's a beautiful. Lisa Young is a beautiful singer, amazing talent. So yeah.
When you hear that all those years ago, it must have been 14, 15, maybe 16 years ago. What comes to mind when you hear that recording again?
I think it's funny because I've sung that song now with so many congregations across the world. You know, I hear the Italian churches singing it in Italian, you know,
Wow.
where we sing Gesù che magnifico nome, you know, and just I hear so many congregation voices and yeah, just really, I think for me what's amazing is just the way that it resonates with people and yeah, just this universal need to worship Jesus and to lift Jesus high. And like I think, you know, Darlene said to you, we weren't created for worship. You know, worship is something that it belongs to God alone. And I think, you know, that's really what comes to mind. And I just, you know, I really don't feel like it's mine in that sense. I feel like it's the church's. I feel like Jesus, what a beautiful name now belongs to all of those people who've sung it for so many years. And that's an honor. It's an honor to watch, definitely.
It is, and when I consider that song, and again, thinking of, you know, I give you my heart, you know, I think to myself, okay, not to break it down to a mechanical, okay, why does these songs work? But there's really a simplicity in them. There really is, and I hear the heart of a young, pure 16-year-old girl, you know, just wanting to respond to her Heavenly Father through that song, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And I listen to I Give You My Heart, and, you know, I hear Ruben, who from what I understand had some background, went to school for composition or took some music courses in that regard. But again, just, you know, you go to school for composition and you probably are equipped to write something a whole lot more elaborate than Lord, I Give You My Heart. But yet what feeds the need is just exactly what it is, a simple heart response to the Lord.
And I think that's something that we really need to, you know, I've noticed coming to North America and, you know, living in LA and it is really easy to make it all complex. You know, I think, you know, the leaders at Hillsong do a great job of being vigilant about excellence and be excellent at your craft, be excellent at music, be excellent in all these areas. But at the same extent, you know, when you get to that place before God, it's just a human meeting with their maker. It's really, I mean, we can't make worship into something that is, you know, more than that. It isn't. It's just literally us meeting with our Creator. And I think that is something that we as the church need to really hold on to, the simplicity of that moment and the honesty, the raw, you know, for us, it wasn't just lyric. It was absolute and utter truth. You know, Lord, I give you my heart. We sang that knowing that it was something that we would be held account to. It was something that we would be measured against. That those lyrics, they're not at all just light. They're very, very heartfelt and meaningful. So I think, you know, in that sense, I'm so passionate about us returning to a simplicity in worship. And I think, you know, some of the liturgical songs that we sing add the most beautiful depth of breadth and meaning, but it's very easy to champion that and to forget the simple or the vernacular or the very, you know, just ordinary songs that just generally that make a real path to heaven that we walk on, you know. So I think it is something that we need to be vigilant about, you know, in that simplicity.
Now, you mentioned before that you grew up with Joel Houston and Marty Sampson and others, and these are names that we, of course, know, especially, you know, I'm in a position where at Liberty I'm teaching, you know, this generation of worship artists and worship leaders, and these are people that they're familiar with, whereas my familiarity would be more so, you know, with you and Ruben and Darlene. But how do you think Joel and Marty's contributions as worship leaders, artists, and songwriters have shaped United and Hillsong music in general?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think United is really, the musical strength of it is just grown so much. You know, I think it is really comparable to any CD that you would listen to, you know, from the latest bands, you know, and I think that's incredible. You know, if you can get to the point where your musicality is so strong, you know, that people recognize that from the very outset, I think that's amazing. I think also they really recognize the ability of the Spirit to move within sound. So there's something about, you know, just like a single note from a guitar, you know, but played with, you know, as worship is completely and entirely different to the same note played by, you know, an artist who's maybe not intuitively really understanding the spiritual realm. So I think, you know, they definitely contribute that. I think United is incredible. It's a beast. Like, it's bigger than, you know, than her, in that, you know, some of the pictures and the things that we see from Latin America and some of the places where they're going, you know, it unifies Christians. It gives youth an avenue to be able to express worship in a way that is cool, and in a way that they don't have to be ashamed to take their friends to. And I think that's an amazing ministry, and Joel's just done a phenomenal job, like, incredible. And I think, you know, some of the guys that he's got around him are just some of the most down-to-earth, honest, most real people that possibly could have, you know, running this ministry. So I think in that sense, as a bystander, as someone that is watching the ministry continue without me, I think it's amazing. I think they're doing an awesome job.
What an incredible legacy that Joel is continuing on. I know his grandparents were in the ministry, and Brian and Bobby just must be so thrilled to be able to sit back and see their son continue really what the Lord helped birth in them, you know, way back in the early 80s. Must be really great. In the 2000s, if we look back in, you know, the last 10, 12 years, it seems like many songs on the United albums would eventually find their way on the Hillsong Church albums. Can you take us through the journey of a song and how it would go from being written for the youth to finding its appeal with the larger congregation? One song that sticks out to me when I think of this is Every Day, or Marty's King of Majesty. They must have been excited to, you know, as teenagers, or maybe even in their early 20s, I'm not sure how old they were when they wrote those, but to see their, you know, see a song that they wrote for their peers to worship now being embraced by their parents and their people their parents' ages, and what a cool thing to see it find a broader audience. Can you take us through that journey?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, you know, like I said, you know, we really wrote songs out of a sense of wanting to really continue what the Spirit was doing in our midst. It was really a response. The United songs all came out of that, and I think Joel's song Every Day was written just from a challenge. I think it might have even been Christine Kane. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was, who did a sermon on just reading your Bible every day and journaling it, and that how important that was. And so Joel put that to music, really, and it was really like around the age of like Jamiroquai, and like, you know, and he was a bass player, so you can really hear those influences. I think, you know, I can anyway in this song, and yeah, and as well, it was written at that tempo where the youth could dance. We're not very creative dancers in Australia. We just tend to jump. It's kind of like the base level dancing, you know. We don't necessarily do a lot of fine art in that regard. But so I think, you know, it was just really so that the youth could continue to jump. Marching was really huge like at that time. So yeah, really, you know, I think like that song, when it was brought to the church, there's this, and I think it's really something that you really only gain out of being there, but the congregation and them songs are just really like a part of the service. So, you know, it's like they know that they're famous, but really they don't care. It's not kind of like at church, you know. So, but I think what they really do very well is discern when God is really with something and in something, and they've learned how to do that, and they're amazing. So, like, if you bring a song to church, and I think pretty much like every service there be something new. Basically, the church have learnt how to express whether they like it or not, and it's like, it seems to be kind of polar opposites. So either they're like 100% into it and it creates a revival, or like they just kind of stand there. And as a writer, I think that's probably really great, you know, because you get immediate feedback. Like, so great, this has traction, you know, they love that. Okay, cool, we'll do it again. Reading that is, you know, sometimes really hard, especially if you love the song. You know, I've watched worship leaders bring songs that they adored, you know, to the church, and just nothing, no response, you know, and like, oh gosh, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. So I think Every Day was one of those songs that, and particularly after the camps, there were a lot of, often we would introduce songs that represented that move of God, you know, or we learnt to, because there was something so amazing that happened in those moments. So every day was introduced, the church went nuts, so it got put on the album. Like, I think it's seriously just as simple as that, you know. And I think one of the things about Marty's songs is how simple they were, and that they were really written by 16, 17, 18-year-old for his peers. And I think that can often come across as being really shallow, but I love that. I love that that voice is given, you know, air in the church, that there was never a sense of, oh, that's too immature to sing at church. Or, you know, my parents are so sweet. They're like in their 60s now. They attend every week, you know, and they ring me, you know, now, and they'd let me know, oh, so-and-so introduced a new song, you know, this is what so-and-so preached on. They love church. It's the center of their lives, you know, and they've watched it grow from a tiny little, you know, or, you know, relatively little church, normal suburban church, to being now this international phenomenon. And they're just so funny. They're like, they would tell me, I remember that song, Better Than, and my dad would just go, oh, no. Here we go again. But he would sing it because he would participate in youth culture. And I think that is something that's just really beautiful about his song, is that he would recognize that that was really important for the youth, and he would watch the youth go nuts around that song and would sing it and would love it. And I think, you know, Hillsong made those voices, youth voices, really available to the wider church. And that is really intergenerational. And I think they're definitely, I don't think that my parents ever feel in that their generation is not heard. I think they feel like that is a huge contribution that they make in really setting up the platform for the next generation. And my dad, he hates classical music. He will never listen to it. So for him, Hillsong is just really, I mean, that is the music of their heart. You know, that's their heart language. So, and they're in their 60s, but, you know, I think, yeah, it's something that was very much both generations centering around. And so when those youth songs got put on the main CDs, it was about really the older generation, about like almost giving validity to what it was to be young and to love Jesus. And I think they did that absolutely deliberately. And if that's considered naive by the outside world, then so be it. You know, I think it did something that was so beautiful in our congregation. So, yeah.
That's amazing. Tanya, maybe take us on the journey of a song. If I'm understanding you correctly, it seems like songs would be written within the Hillsong family, and really the church ended up being the barometer of whether or not they stuck to the wall or not. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, Joel's definitely spoken about that in the past. You know, he takes it to the church, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it never sees the light of day again.
So tell us, you know, for instance, you know, some of the songs that you wrote, King of Love, Hear Our Prayer, I'm sure that there's an individual story for each of those, but generically speaking, what structures are set up in place that if you are part of the Hillsong community, for instance, you know, Raymond Badham or, you know, or Joel or somebody writes a song, what structures are in place that they can kind of, you know, pitch those songs, and how does a song go from being something that Joel is jamming out to in his basement apartment to being sung, you know, on the Hillsong platform? Yeah,
I think, like you said, that every song is different, but there is a, you know, an overall kind of process. That process is changed significantly over the time, but at the same extent, at its core, it's still the same. So I think really ultimately the writers are people who are often behind the scenes, much more the ones who would be reading theology books and, you know, kind of working out how do we talk prophetically to the culture as we see it, and what is it about the Bible that is, you know, not yet manifest in our midst. So I think, you know, the writers are people who are constantly on the lookout to, it's like Brueggemann and his prophetic imagination is a, you know, an academic text that comes to mind, in that they prophetically probably critique, I guess, the outside culture, and then also they energize it. So when God is moving in something, you know, it's something that we can, as Christians, get behind and go, yeah. So, you know, thinking about, for example, you know, the Live Aid concerts and just the passion of, you know, Bono and a whole heap of other rock musicians to really start to engage the third world, or, you know, the which is bad language, but you know what I mean. So that those portions of our earth that are not, you know, that are in poverty, I think, you know, that was something that, you know, the writers jumped on immediately, because it was like, that's resonant with biblical values. That's something that we can really energize and we can agree with, you know. And then there's other things that I think, you know, that they critique. So it's a constant process behind the stage of creativity, and that process can't be underestimated. I think, you know, it means writers spending time in the Word and theology and books, and, you know, really just prayerfully looking at culture. I think, you know, when we sit down often, and, you know, I've learned my songwriting skills from Hillsong. You know, it's not necessarily representative of all the writers, but I think, you know, with that in mind, with the idea that we would want to be speaking prophetically into the world, sit down with the Bible and go, okay, God, what is it that you want to say, and what have you said before, and look at, you know, the tradition of the church and also the biblical word, and looking at as well, you know, what is it about me? What do I wish had a voice, you know, in this corporate environment, and what do I wish that we were singing in? And from that, a song gets crafted, you know, from those, the engagement of the musical and the theological and the passion, you know, a song is made. I think, you know, basically just, you know, very simply, we put it down onto a CD or MP3, just basically a vocal and one instrument normally, and that then gets emailed through to the publishers, to, you know, to Hillsong Publishing. And really, I mean, when other writers evaluate and listen to it with an ear in mind, does this have a prophetic voice to our culture? Does this say something that hasn't been said? Is this desperately needing to be sung? And I think from there it will be introduced into church. It's also the lyrics are evaluated by Robert Ferguson for biblical content. Is there anything that is heresy in there? You know, are we singing anything that we shouldn't be? All of that is, Robert does an excellent job of working with songwriters in that regard. And then it's introduced to church. The church, as I said before, they basically let us know whether they like it or not. You know, they definitely let, you know, I think, you know, that's true of any church congregation, really, but it's really just being attentive to signals. And then I think, you know, from there, you know, Ruben or Joel or whoever is the project coordinator for an album would sit down and try and craft a bit of a story to the album. And I know, like, Darlene has written some stuff online about thinking and a bit of crafting to that. So the songs would then be taken into a band setting and workshopped. You know, it might be like 3 weeks of everyday rehearsal, workshopping the songs until they're at the point where they can be really released, you know, in the album form. So I think some of the songs, it might be a year's process. It might, you know, the albums are done annually, so it might release an album, and the week after, you know, a song comes out, and then it evolves, you know, and then it's kind of easy, and it's just captured on the next album. Sometimes it's a real struggle, and I know some of the best songs have been written at the absolute last minute. I used to get so just frustrated at Joel and Marty because, as you know, one of the administrators, it'd be like, why can't you write this brilliant song 6 months ago when we're desperate for, like, you know, new songs to come out as opposed to the night before the recording? So, but, you know, it's something about pressure, so...
You know, have there been songs that you remember on projects that were added right at the last minute that turned out to be really well-embraced songs? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the United albums, like in like the early 2000s. I think, you know, one of them, I'm not sure whether this is like the right one I'm thinking of, but Jesus, Will You Light My Way? You know, was like, I think that was one of the ones, like on that album there were about 3 songs that just kind of emerged out of nowhere. And the first time we heard them was when we played the album. And, you know, we were like, oh my gosh, those are brilliant. And then I think, you know, really Joel and Marty just had this intuitive sense of what they needed to put on the CD. And I think sometimes, you know, in the writing process in the studio is the best time to get a clear head and really just put it down. But I think they're trying to, you know, and I don't know that that's true of more recent releases. I think, you know, they've learnt how to probably better time manage to get the songs out to the congregation. Because I think really ultimately Hillsong has that at its heart, that the congregation would really decide which songs really do get included. The church is the artist. So in that sense, you know, the church decides the songs that really are going to go out to the world. And, you know, I think sometimes that has a local meaning only. Some of the songs, you know, probably aren't as widely sung as others. And some have a different time. You know, some of them it takes, you know, a couple of years for really people to go, that was really prophetic for now, you know. But yeah, I think on the whole, you know, looking over the repertoire of Hillsong music, you know, you just think like it's absolutely incredible the way that they've been able to pinpoint the right songs in the right moment and, you know, just release them prophetically.
Well, the one thing that I wanted to mention and just maybe have you comment on is the thing that strikes me is, you know, probably over the history of Hillsong, we could probably come up with a list of maybe 50 or 60 songwriters, but really at its core, you know, I think Reuben Morgan, Marty Sampson, Joel Houston, Darlene Check, Miriam Webster, you have a core group of about 20 songwriters who have written these massive worship songs that have been embraced by the entire world, really. That has to be unique. Would you not agree?
I think, you know, what's really unique about it is the way in which they synthesize writers who come in from the outside and ways that they develop internally writers. So I think, like Brooke Fraser is an example of that, you know, so she already had a career when she came to Hillsong, but, you know, just some of the songs that she's written have just been amazingly Hillsong-esque. They've got that, you know, and in a sense maybe they changed the sounds and maybe the sounds evolved into that, but it was like a collision, I guess. And when you look at some of the writers that have emerged from what, you know, from the really younger, the next, again, up-and-coming emerging Hillsong United people like Matty Crocker and some of the writers there, really, Hillsong kind of births writers. You know, it's kind of like, it's something that is, it is unique. And I think it does go back to this thought that writing happens in community. Writing is best done when you have a community of songwriters who are all, you know, and you do have, in any community, you have a couple of people who are out the front leading the way and really crafting how it's done. But there's also a stack of people behind who are submitting and who are pushing and propelling those writers on to better. So I think there's something amazing about, you know, a synergy of a community of writers working together. It's awesome.
That's incredible. You know, through our conversation today, we've talked a lot about change and progression and even risk that Hillsong has taken. I know we've chatted before about how Hillsong, you know, probably different than a lot of churches in America, will really, you know, use songs for a season, but then almost intentionally say, we're looking to what God has for us next. Could you speak to a little bit about, you know, what kind of risks did Hillsong take in establishing their music ministry? What kind of decisions did they make even in those early days and that are still used today that say, okay, we're going to, you know, even the risk of introducing a new song and what that all entails and how that's really served their music ministry and built their music ministry?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that comes to mind is Brian Houston has this, like, iconic voice, you know, he's just like Papa for so many people, but he says, you know, the best is yet to come. And it's this mantra, I guess, you know, this amazing phrase that has just been said time and time again, you know, that really, it really is something that, you know, he has impressed upon the church, that the best is yet to come. He's a vision caster and he's amazing at it. And I think, you know, really when it comes to that commitment to the next song, to the next project, to really being where God is in the moment, it's really, that is something that is really a fundamental, really, of Hillsong. So I guess it's really driven by Brian and by, you know, his leadership as a pastor. And yeah, sorry, what was the second bit?
Well, maybe you can comment on this. I know we've talked before. In a typical year, you guys will have a roster of songs that you use, and correct me if I misunderstood, but usually, you know, once that year is done, those songs are put behind, and you guys are asking God for the new stuff. And so for instance, you know, chances are, you know, Hillsong isn't, you know, singing "Shout to the Lord" as regularly as maybe some American churches are anymore. That's kind of in the vault in the past. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, like, I personally, I'm in America at the moment, so, you know, I'd love to be, you know, in these conversations with them, but, you know, from what I understand as, you know, having been a part of it, that's definitely true. every so often, they draw from their past, absolutely. I think, like recently they released It Is Well With My Soul, which was, a fundraiser for the victims of the Brisbane floodings. And they definitely draw from tradition in terms of writing and their expectation as writers. And probably that's the aspect of Hillsong that is not seen, that it is, it's services that run constantly, and so, communion moments and stuff create opportunities. But in terms of Shout to the Lord, really, I mean, it is a sense of there have been a lot of great moves of God, and I think, one of the wisdoms that Brian brings is that when those moves of God really start looking back into their own tradition and considering themselves as having arrived, that's when really their power stops being, or the momentum really stops, and the Spirit, it's like a pride, really, that kind of gets in the way of what the Spirit wants to do. And I think in that sense, Hillsong holds what it does very lightly. It really understands that, Shout to the Lord has really resonated with a lot of people, but at the same extent, the priority is really on getting the Hillsong community to worship and really explaining, like, I think of New York and all the hundreds of new converts that have come through the doors. Really, for them, Shout to the Lord doesn't have anything, no emotional attachment. There's nothing in that song for them at all. So other than learning the history and learning, well, this is, a bit of what we've done before you got here. So I think, in that sense, really, it is about putting songs that will really be, really help people engage with God now. And evangelism is a huge strength of Hillsong. When you get a baby Christian through the doors, really, and you think, okay, what can we, we really need to help them. Is Shout the Lord, the best thing for them to be singing at this point in time? Well, if it is, sure, I think they'll include it. But I think there's other things and questions and, and other things that haven't been put to song. And so I think that's really where the Hillsong writing community is at.
How is there's always an element of risk, and I think in terms of you've shared earlier about trying some new songs, and the church will really determine whether it takes off. How did Brian and Bobby create that environment where it would be okay, like to try out a song? Because I think a lot of churches in America, we get tied to what works, and we have our favorite publishers and our favorite writers, and we don't necessarily cultivate what Hillsong has. Yet it's that very thing, that willingness to take risk, would you not agree that's really helped facilitate new music?
Yeah, I have this memory. I mean, Brian is just amazing. He has this ability to work with structure and then to wreck the structure. And I think I love that. I love, my parents are so funny because I watch them enjoy that too, as people who are, have been there from the beginning and who, have really been behind his vision for 25, 28 years, so I love it. We call him sometimes, he's just so funny. He can, in a moment, if he considers that, Hillsong is getting too set in its ways, he'll deliberately change something, He has an ability to start doing somersaults in the middle of his sermon because he feels, that there's a formula and it's starting to hold me captive, and so he'll break that deliberately. And I think that's his personality, and it definitely comes through in the community that they've created. And Bobby is the same. I look at, I mean, you only have to look at the marketing that comes out of the Colour Your World Women's Conference, and she sits there with the Holy Spirit and in prayer, and you just see these amazingly creative visual artworks come out through graphic design, and that is really representative of Bobby. She's this creative entity, who is constantly listening to the next thing of the Holy Spirit and praying that would become, evident in the community's midst. So I think it flows from their personalities, and it's not, they don't find it hard. I think though, maybe that is something about Australia. Maybe, we hate the structure. It's like, get us out. I think the formalities, of church and the ways that they sometimes draw boundaries around what God can do in a service are things that, that we kind of react against, and so, but at the same time, in order to have a great big church, you have to have structures and you have to work with them, and God was a very organized God, in terms of like the way that he thought about creation, it wasn't just a mash of stuff on paper and, there we go. It was like very ordered, and the creative process is very ordered, but it's entirely new. So, and there's a sermon series that I preached, which was called "God Created Something Out of Nothing," and where he really talks about the creative process and that God spoke into being from nothing and created something, and the order that went with that, but also that amazing creative moment. So yeah, I think it comes from their personalities.
Well, it's been a wonderful example to the church in North America, just to see blowing structure out of the water and to see what God can do. And certainly He's moved in Hillsong Church because of your guys' commitment to not stay stagnant, which is something that we can all fall susceptible to. We've talked before about how you feel like there were some special projects that were close to your heart. I know I've mentioned By Your Side and Blessed. Those are probably two of my favorites, simply because of the plethora of enduring congregational songs. It just seemed like those two albums, I think they were back-to-back or fairly close in recording with each other, just had tons of songs that really resonated with a lot of churches. Was there something special about these recordings to you? Maybe I got them wrong. Maybe those aren't the two that we've talked about. But have there been those special recordings? And how would you describe those and what they mean to you?
So I think, By Your Side was amazing in that Marty Sampson really takes a very visual role in the worship leading, and that was really representative of my age group. And I think that was something that we felt so proud about. We were actually being able to influence church, and who are we? Just like just the kids of the people who were a part of things. So I think in that sense, it was a special recording. It definitely, I felt a sense of responsibility. I conducted the youth choir in that recording, and it was a convergence, I guess, in that sense. Our youth world converged with the church world, and that was really beautiful and meaningful.
How old would you have been, Tanya, when that was recorded?
Yeah, really good question. I think I was 17, 18, 17. Oh, yeah, I think I was about to turn 18. So, that was like amazing. So I remember being in my first year of uni, going to rehearsals in amongst all my university courses, and it was beautiful. I think what was really beautiful about it was how Ruben as well really took a role in that and really he's a brilliant worship leader, brilliant, and the people just sing when he worship leads. So I think in that sense it was really fun as well, like we had these songs like, like You've Turned My Morning Into Dancing and Our Crazy Little Dance, and I think in that sense, it was really fun. I think, there's lots of other recordings. They're all, like Darlene talks about it as being a snapshot in the life of 1 year of our church or of Hillsong Church. And there's been lots of that I haven't been at, but, I think like some of the ones that were really meaningful for me, I think the 2003 United album, To the Ends of the Earth, I think. That was really beautiful and poignant for me because I saw that as being, the new guard of United came to the fore, and every single one of them has a story, which I think, telling that story is really going to be interesting because as we get further away from the event, the oral history gets lost. So I think what you're doing is really amazing, pulling it all together so that people can learn from this church. And I think as well, I think what we talked about as well was just the power of the song Hosanna, and that it spoke to both the past and the future, that there was this visual of people worshipping God, and singing Hosanna. It was almost it's an amazing biblical passage. It's this prophetic passage of who Jesus will be, but it's seen before he even goes to the cross, and I think Brooke managed to pull out that scripture and really write it in a way that really enabled us to see that we were really this prophetic kind of movement of who Jesus will be in the in the eschatology of the earth, and how it will be renewed, but also looking back to the move of God that happens in United, and it was just a really beautiful song for the church. Saviour King was also just the most beautiful songs of the church, and it's almost hymn-like in the way that it's written.
That's one that we still sing around Liberty. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I think when you worship it, and you would know there's this power in it that it's so sweet, and but it's got a brokenness in it, but really you can really sing that song, and there's something that really affects change. It's like the prayer of the righteous man avails much. It's really got that sense of something happens, when you sing that song. So yeah.
I'd mentioned the Blessed Project. The one thing I loved about that album was it felt like that was the coming of kind of the best congregational songs that were coming out of the youth. Yeah, I think of Now That You're Near, Most High was on there, King of Majesty, I Adore, and then just anthems that are still sung. It Made Me Glad. I can remember being in Bible school and singing you talk about songs that are written like hymns, All the Heavens by Reuben Morgan, just so gorgeous. And then really just for worship leaders that want to write scripture songs, you can't come by a better blueprint than a song like Blessed, which is, taken right out of the Psalms, almost verbatim, word for word. And what an intense project, too. When you listen to even the production of that record, just layer upon layer upon layer, it's just a big, big, big sound.
Yeah.
And
I think that album really, for me, epitomizes Darlene's kind of style. For me, it's a very North American friendly style in a sense. It's almost like Australia and America kind of have this dialogue musically. For me, that album, I can totally see how because it relates. And I think like Miriam, that song Made Me Glad. It was almost really like her songs, that and the previous song she released, which I've forgotten the title, but were really written in a sense of being really passionate for the North American church, and particularly after 9/11, and really just coming to this point where it was like we really feel very indebted to the way that gospel has inspired Hillsong to kind of start this movement. So I think it did speak back into that, and Darlene definitely that's her style, and she travels with some musicians who are very gospel inspired, and I love that collision of sounds.
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding, and you look at the songs that have endured. Lots of songs have endured at Hillsong, but the songs like "Made Me Glad" and "Blessed" and "Shout to the Lord," "Mighty to Save," some of the other ones that you've mentioned. That and even your song "Jesus, What a Beautiful Name," that really they have staying power. And it's really neat to see, even over in North America, the updated hymnals that they're publishing now have some of these songs. There's hymnals that now have "Shout to the Lord" and "How Great Is Our God," and it's just really cool to see tradition adopting the worship expressions of the last 30, 40 years. Our final question, Tanya, and I do thank you for your time today. I think this has been incredibly helpful. In your opinion, what is the lasting legacy of Hillsong music? Why does it appeal to so many people of so many different ages? And what do you think is in the future for Hillsong music?
Well, I think, two things that come out from really what we've discussed before as well, just the prayer and the simplicity of this worship style that is just really heart set on God, really, and I think that is an enduring legacy. And I think, that is a continuing legacy. It's something that is really just... the next album, Cornerstone, I think will just be amazing. And I'm already hearing such great reports about the songs that have, been recorded. So I'm sure that will be one that will, again, do like every other Hillsong album, just totally and utterly change the bar as to, as songwriting. So, I think, and then the other is just that the church is the continuing legacy. It's now got new Hillsong churches are being planted in Denmark and in Melbourne in Australia, and a whole heap of different cities, and Germany, there's a new Hillsong, a Hillsong that has converged in a church that had been in Constance for a while. I think, as we look forward, really the tension and the amazing opportunity before Hillsong to really start to represent the global church and to really to really wrestle with what are questions that are, you know, about God that are being had globally, and how to reach this generation with the message of Jesus Christ. That is something that, you know, is really for the future of Hillsong, and is super exciting. And I think, you know, really the only thing that we can say really is what Brian himself would say, which is really that the best is yet to come. And I really believe that for Hillsong. And, you know, whatever part I play, it's my home church. And, I would love to be more involved in the future. And we will see. It's all yet to be written. I think that's the exciting thing.
It definitely is. If you could leave songwriters and worship artists and worshipers that have been inspired by Hillsong and the legacy of Hillsong, if you could leave them with one piece of encouragement, one piece of advice as they seek to lead teams and to really, as they look to Hillsong as an influence, and as they look to Hillsong as something that's molded and shaped them, as they go now and lead their worship ministries, and as they go now and write songs for their worship ministry, what is one piece of advice that you would give them?
Yeah, and I think, this is one that, I shared with a couple of, the students that we talked to the other day, but which is really that you are going to be accountable for your gifts and for your call. And Hillsong is a community of people who are all living with that same mandate upon their lives to really do the best with what they have for Jesus, and to live completely surrendered to Him and in line with His mission. So I think, if I could say anything to songwriters, I've sat there in moments being intimidated by other songs and how great they are, and, sitting there going, I could never write like this person, I could never write like that person. But the thing is that we were called to write like us. And I think that voice is so important, and to really operate in that and to learn it and to be able to use that voice is something that every songwriter needs to feel they have the right to do. And so I think in that sense, maybe it is about getting a little bit of Australia in and breaking the rules and working out, and playing and just seeing songwriting as a craft, getting their Bible and getting into the Word and really understanding it and reading theology and, working out how can we be prophetic to this generation. Because I think the thing is that Hillsong is moving so fast. There are no people who are able to sit on the benches and watch. And I think that is really this generation, and that's this time and era. Like, there is no room for us to sit on the benches and watch Hillsong having a fantastic ministry of worship to the rest of the world. I think the necessity is for people to really get into their local communities, get into their church, and do it in dialogue. Use the Hillsong songs, learn from Hillsong, learn from, these people, but also figure out how to really worship God in your context and how to draw people into your, in your world, and the unsaved people that you're going to coffee shops with, that you're going to McDonald's with. Those people can only be reached by you. We can't, that Darlene cannot be everywhere, in the world at one time. Like, you can't expect that Darlene's going to turn up in Kentucky Fried Chicken and just, it's not going to happen. You're there, so you make the most of that opportunity and you write the songs that need to be written and that you're hearing. And I think that if we can all do that, then I really think a new generation is emerging that can dialogue and talk to each other. And I'm excited about the opportunities for songwriters in this era. And yeah, it's definitely not an era to be intimidated by other people's giftings, but to, really just prayerfully come to God and use our own in the way that He created us. So, yeah.
Well, that's great advice, Tanya, and this has been incredibly helpful. So thank you once again for allowing us to interview you, and we pray God's blessings on your ministry as well.
All right. Thank you so much.
No problem.